the government is keen to emphasise, it's as much about fostering and encouraging innovation in the UK, creating the environment to enable businesses to feel free to develop AI, invest in AI, whilst at the same time, protecting the public, businesses, consumers from the potential harms and maybe some of the worst excesses.
You're listening to Rethinking Insurance, a podcast series from WTW, where we discuss the issues facing P&C, life, and composite insurers around the globe, as well as exploring the latest tools, techniques, and innovations that will help you rethink insurance.
Hello and welcome to the Rethinking Insurance podcast series. I'm your host, Chris Halliday from WTW, and in this episode we're discussing AI regulation and the impact it will have and is already having on insurers. Before we start, I'd like to welcome our guest, James Clark, who is a partner at DLA Piper. Thanks for joining us, James.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, James, so you're a partner at the law firm DLA Piper, and you specialize in data privacy law, cybersecurity, and now the regulation of new technologies such as AI. I suppose to get started, I wanted to understand, how did you move into AI? What brought you here?
Yeah, so as you say, I'm sort of first and foremost a data protection and privacy lawyer. And as we sort of might come on to discuss, and as you know, Chris, AI systems are fundamentally creatures of data. So they rely on large amounts of data initially to train the models that underpin the AI systems. And then throughout their life cycle, they're processing data, producing outputs that constitute data. And given the very broad scope of personal data under data protection laws, particularly in the UK and the EU, data protection law is very often relevant when AI systems are both being developed and then used in practice. And so it's really that angle that I first approached AI from. And then, a couple of years ago, did a very interesting project working with the UK government, looking at how the UK should approach the regulation of AI. And that sort of opened my eyes more broadly to the regulatory challenge around AI, which is, as broad as the potential applications for AI, which are, as the listeners may be aware, almost limitless. So it's a huge challenge, this question of how we best regulate AI, but it's a very exciting one. I'm very much enjoying sort of being at the forefront of advising clients on that.
It's really exciting. I mean, from my perspective, we see the use cases of AI are just, as you say, almost feels almost limitless at the moment. I'm sure we'll start touching those limits at some point, but it's so exciting to be there and helping it happen. And I know from talking to our clients that often the legal challenges and the question marks come up quite early in the process, and they can sometimes feel like it's a restricting the innovation. So it's exciting that you're there talking to governments as well as insurers and other clients about how to sort of free themselves so they can do that innovation.
And I think that's exactly the balance that the UK is trying to strike. So, the title of the white paper that was published last year is a pro-innovation approach to AI in the UK, and the government is keen to emphasise it's as much about fostering and encouraging innovation in the UK, creating the environment to enable businesses to feel free to develop AI, invest in AI, whilst at the same time protecting the public, businesses, consumers from the potential harms and maybe some of the worst excesses of the technology. So sort of getting that balance right is definitely something that the government here is focused on, and governments more broadly around the world, as everyone sort of wants to be the leader in AI innovation, but at the same time realizes they need to protect the public from some of the very clear harms.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if we could maybe start with a bit, stepping back a little bit and understanding a little bit about how AI is regulated today And I know we're going to get into some of the new regulations, the white papers, the EU AI Act, but let's talk about today and the sort of regulatory frameworks and the areas that insurers would be concerned about in implementing these new technologies right now.
Yeah, of course. So what we have today is what I sometimes describe as the indirect regulation of AI. So we don't really yet have any laws that were specifically designed with AI in mind or sort of focused on AI. But what we do have is a range of legal frameworks that, were not necessarily designed with AI in mind, but which nevertheless are relevant to the development and use of AI and will engage and create, legal obligations, rights for individuals where AI is deployed. And so maybe to pick up on a few examples of what those are. So one would sort of be my field, data protection law. We've already spoken about the fact that personal data is often used both to develop and operate AI systems. And where that is the case, individuals whose personal data is being used will have all of the normal rights that they will have in other contexts under laws like the GDPR. So, rights of transparency, rights to access to data, and perhaps most importantly, the right that we have under GDPR not to be subject to automated decision making in respect of significant decisions other than in certain circumstances. So, for example, a decision about how to settle someone's claim or indeed an underwriting decision might be a significant decision. And data protection law already regulates the circumstances in which a decision like that can be taken and the rights that individuals have. And hopefully it's quite apparent that it will increasingly be what we might call AI systems that are being used to take those sort of automated decisions. So data protection law is one important field. Another would be intellectual property law. And we've seen a lot of disputes in this field already, for example, from rights holders whose data is used to train generative AI systems, litigation from people like Getty Images, for example, who are concerned that the material that they hold rights in is being scraped and used by big tech to train and develop AI systems, but also questions about the extent to which IP rights continue to exist in the outputs of AI systems. So to what extent do I own something that is created by an AI system? Can that still generate copyright for me as the person who's using that AI system to create a piece of creative output, if you like? And then probably the final one to touch on, particularly relevant for the insurance industry is financial services regulation and the role that regulators like the FCA and the PRA have to play. And as we'll see as we sort of move through the podcast, the approach that is being taken in the UK at least is to try and rely to the greatest extent possible on existing regulators and existing regulatory frameworks. And so what that means is in the world of insurance, primarily looking to the FCA and the PRA to use their existing powers to monitor and enforce against the misuse of AI, using existing principles like, for example, consumer protection principles and the concept of treating customers fairly, and how that might be impacted. For example, if you are relying on an AI system and predictive models to take pricing decisions, for example, is there a risk that certain customers might be discriminated against, may even be priced out of insurance markets through the increased use of AI? And so, all of those existing principles that the FCA applies when regulating firms, they are now thinking very carefully about how to translate those to the use and the misuse of AI.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it was one of the themes. I think the Bank of England did a request for information around the topic of regulation of AI, and it was one of the themes of the respondents was that there's a huge amount of regulation already around consumer protection and financial regulation, and a lot of this is outcomes focused. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing an AI or you're doing it manually, or you've got a statistical model or some data. The outcome is the key thing. But I think as we'll go on to talk about, there are some harms and some things that maybe are exacerbated or increasing in probability with AI. You mentioned intellectual property. It was interesting, actually, whether there's an opportunity for the insurance industry around some of these new risks and the litigation risk. Do you see new insurance products coming out that might protect firms against these sort of litigations?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly something that insurers will be thinking about. I mean, the stakes are so high in this space, which is why we're already seeing such a huge amount of litigation. A lot of that happening at the moment in the US, but it is starting to come across the Atlantic as well. So, yeah, I mean, and if you are a business, for example, whereby substantial amount of the value of your business depends on rights that you hold in creative property, and the ability to continue creating intellectual property and monetizing that intellectual property, then something like generative AI is a massively disruptive technology that potentially upends your entire business model. So when companies like Getty Images, for example, but also lots of big media companies, when they are bringing these claims against the technology companies who sit behind some of the big generative AI applications, it is to a large extent sort of bet the company stuff for a lot of those businesses. That's the way they see it. And yeah, I mean, we'll see how it plays out, but I think probably at a high level, my bet would be that you can't hold back the tide of technology. And that actually what we'll probably start to see over time is some of these big media companies, working with the technology and sort of trying to work out how they can bring it in-house and, apply it to their existing business model rather than just fighting against the tide.
Absolutely. I think it's a big moment in a lot of creative industries, and there'll be this transition period to whatever the new position is, where you have AI working together with creatives, so that we still get that value to the economy of the creative industries, but with the added benefit of AI. Yeah. And I think that maybe a place that insurers can support is through that transition period, because you wouldn't want to lose a big chunk of the creative industries as we're finding out how they should and could adapt to the new world. So, I mean, that's regulation today, and I think that's really helpful to see what the frameworks are. But let's talk a bit about regulation tomorrow. So, obviously, specifically the EU AI Act, which it feels like it's been talked about for a long time, and I'm sure that's how these regulations work. But I remember reading drafts and drafts about it and trying to figure out, well, what exactly is the latest wording? But it's all a lot clearer now, because earlier this year, it's effectively being released and it's going through the final stages through the EU regulatory bodies. Would you be able to just briefly, for the listeners that don't know the Act, could you briefly just outline the scope of the Act and why it is impactful for insurers?
Yeah, of course. So I think if the listeners have heard of one AI law, it probably is the EU AI Act. It is sort of the world's first, sort of comprehensive, horizontal law that is designed specifically to focus on the regulation of AI systems. It is, as we say, an EU law, but also one, importantly, that has extraterritorial effects. So, businesses that are selling into the EU, or even, businesses that are using AI systems where the outputs of those systems then have an impact on individuals in the EU, are potentially caught by the law. As you say, we now have a sort of political agreement on the final version of the text, so we know what it's going to say. We're just waiting for it to be published in the official journal, and there will then be, which is likely actually to happen essentially even by the end of this month, so May 2024, we'll then enter sort of between 2 and 3 year transition period, depending on which part of the Act you're talking about, which will really be the tunnel that businesses will then go in to actually prepare to comply with the Act. It's comprehensive, as I say, so it applies to sort of all parts of the economy, all sectors. But very importantly, it's a risk-based law. So it doesn't regulate all AI systems, and it doesn't regulate them all in the same way. And the most important, category of AI system under the Act is what's referred to as a high-risk AI system, which is where the vast majority of obligations lie. And most of those obligations will apply to the provider or the developer of the AI system, so whoever's building the AI system. But there are also obligations that apply to the user or deployer of the AI system, where those are different people. And then specifically in relation to the insurance industry, one of the categories of a high-risk AI system is an AI system that is used in the context of health or life insurance, both for pricing, underwriting, but also in the context of claims decisioning. And so any insurers who have health or life business will need to consider it from that angle. But there are also other categories of high-risk AI system that will apply to a much broader range of businesses. So, for example, if you use AI systems in the context of managing your workforce, monitoring employees, again, that's a high-risk use case. So a lot for businesses to think about, and also important to remember that, as I say, that the majority of the obligations will sit with the provider of the system, but that's not just big tech, right? So, lots of businesses will be building their own AI tools, even if those tools depend on existing models. So, you may take an existing large language model, for example, and use it to develop your own AI system in-house. If you do that, you are then a provider of that AI system under the Act. So this is definitely the time for businesses to be getting to grips with the Act, working out, are they caught, in which areas are they caught as a provider or a deployer or both, and then beginning to plan and build the compliance framework that will be needed to address the relevant obligations.
It's interesting for me, the focus on life and health insurance in particular. I don't know if you know any of the background to that, and maybe why it doesn't cover other insurances like motor insurance, which is compulsory product in all of the EU, and often the first insurance product people will buy when they buy their first car. And one of the most expensive products as well for people, especially those on a low income who maybe don't have life and health insurance.
Yeah, I think these things they're always horse trading to some extent. So if you sort of followed the development of the Act and the various drafts, you see things come in and then get taken out, and generally the Parliament wants to expand the scope and add in more high-risk categories, but then the council, will want to narrow the scope, and so things get traded in and out. Which then often means, as I think you're suggesting, you sometimes get gaps that feel like they're not completely logical, or why is this thing high risk but this thing over here is not high risk? But ultimately, that's the way that these laws get put together. And I suppose the thing to note there is that they've retained the ability to change that list of high risk systems over time. So the idea is that they will keep it under review and add in new things, potentially take things out over time.
That makes sense. And so we've talked about the areas of business, and you briefly touched on claims and pricing and underwriting. Are there any other specific sort of use cases that we're seeing insurers using that might be captured?
Yeah, so I think those are the big ones, and the ones where for a very long time insurance businesses have been using mathematical models, and then they've been using machine learning, and for insurance business this is a continuum, rather than a new technology that has just arrived out of the ether in the last year or two. So in those contexts, it's a continuum. I suppose what is a bit newer for some businesses is the generative AI side of things, the natural language processing. And so there are other use cases, for example, things like more sophisticated chatbots for communicating with customers, things like sentiment analysis that you see being implemented in call centers to help sort of manage interactions with customers in a more sophisticated way. So that sort of thing is newer for some businesses and is also potentially subject to obligations under the Act. So, for example, if you use AI systems to interact with a human being, then you have to, there are sort of labeling requirements, right? So you have to make it clear to the individual that they're interacting with a bot, which, today might be pretty obvious for most people, but over time will probably become less and less obvious as those systems become more sophisticated.
I mean, in my personal experience, it's not always easy to understand when you're interacting with a chatbot or a chat function which has a person behind it. So I think that will become very important. And obviously, you mentioned so it's an EU Act, and it does have these extraterritorial scopes for firms operating in the EU or with the EU. But thinking beyond the EU, and maybe we can talk about the UK, but also globally, are there other reasons why this would be interesting for insurance companies that don't have activities in the EU?
Yeah, so I think we often talk about the Brussels effect in terms of EU regulation, that often they are the first to regulate in a given area, or if they're not the very first, then they're the first significant player to do so. And obviously it's a large market, and that means that when they do regulate, that often then has sort of ripple effects. And either leads to copycat regulations in other parts of the world. So that will be a really interesting one to watch, whether there are other jurisdictions that take the AI Act as a template for their own AI law. But also,
as we've seen with GDPR, I mean,
exactly,
there are many countries around the world that have got something that looks very similar to GDPR, and I agree with you. It'd be interesting to see what happens with AI.
Yeah, and even if that doesn't happen, and my bet would be it doesn't happen to quite the same extent as the GDPR. But the other thing that businesses sometimes do is take it as a bit of a benchmark. So even in areas where they might not be directly subject to the AI Act because it's non-EU business, there may be helpful principles in the AI Act in terms of what we talk about as a sort of governance framework for managing AI risks. And there is stuff in the AI Act that would be sort of sensible good practice anyway. So, for example, the requirements around data quality when you're developing an AI system, ensuring that your data is, accurate, fit for purpose, free from bias. I mean, those are all things that you would want to be doing, to ensure the quality of your products, but also to manage broader legal risks. And so, what I do expect is that we'll see businesses rely on the AI Act as a bit of a framework, and maybe taking the bits that they think are useful and leaving some of the stuff that isn't as useful, in areas where they're not actually directly subject to the Act.
I think we've seen that. I mean, even the definition of AI itself, I was used to, years ago when I was presenting on AI, my definition of AI is all the things that computers cannot yet do. It's my definition of AI. So when computers can play chess, well, that's not AI anymore. And they can play Go, well, that's no longer AI. But it does seem that finally we're coming around to some sort of consensus in the sort of international regulatory community around the definition of AI. So I think that's helpful. And then there are other things, reading the ABI guidance, for example, for UK insurers on the use of AI. There are a large number of themes which overlap between that and the AI. So I think that we can see, certainly in the UK, this starting to come true, where they're learning from the EU AI Act and other regulations.
Yeah.
Is there anything?
Right.
Yeah.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I think one of the reassuring things is that there is a lot of alignment globally on what's sometimes referred to as safe or ethical principles for the development and use of AI. And those have been adopted, in bodies like the OECD, the UN, so a sort of supranational level, as well as in individual laws, and including in the UK White Paper. And those are sort of common sense things like principles of safety, security, transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance. All things that you'd hope broadly most people agree on, and those principles run like a bit of a golden thread through most of the law, most of the guidance around AI, and will therefore probably form the bedrock for a lot of the governance programs and compliance programs that businesses put in place.
That makes sense. So you mentioned when we started talking about the AI Act that it's 2 or 3 years of implementation time if it does get finalised at the end of this month. But what should insurers and businesses be doing to make the most out of AI in general and do so safely?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think a lot of this starts with just mapping where the business is already using AI systems, right? I mean, so you can only control what you understand, and in the same way that, for example, when businesses begun their GDPR compliance programs, the starting point was often, let's actually map out where within the business we're using personal data, and in particular, where are we using more sensitive data or higher volumes of data? Where are the heightened areas of risk? In the same way, what I'm now seeing companies do is map out their use of AI systems, and in particular, doing it in a risk-based way. So thinking, where are we, either using AI systems that are high risk because of the sensitivity of the data they're processing or the criticality of the decision that they are being used to take. So we're using AI systems to take actually a really important decision or to support a business process that's really critical. And so that you sort of start with that mapping, and then beginning to build what I keep referring to as a sort of governance risk management framework for AI, which is going to have a number of pillars, and you can sort of divide it in a number of different ways, but will include things like, from a governance perspective, ensuring that there is leadership for AI within the business, typically some sort of cross-functional steering or oversight group that has representation from different functions, articulating what the business's overall approach to AI adoption is going to be, how aggressive or how risk averse does the business want to be in terms of how it uses AI, then sort of going on to articulate some sort of key do's and don'ts for the business, some key sort of policy statements that help to clarify what the business is prepared to do and not do, and some of the most fundamental controls that need to be in place, probably by reference to those safe AI principles that I spoke about earlier. And then, from there, developing more granular risk assessment tools that for, specific proposed use cases that the business has, can assess and do a deeper dive on the legal risks associated with such a use case, recommend controls for how to build the AI system in a compliant way, and then, obviously, audit and monitor that those controls are being complied with in practice. And then probably the final one to mention would be the sort of the third party side of it. So, a lot of this will depend on, either buying in AI systems from technology vendors, or even just buying in the data that you need for an AI system. And then at the other end of the pipeline, selling AI potentially to customers. So, if you're an insurance broker, you might be selling some services to an insurer that depend on the use of AI, and thinking about how you manage your risk at both ends of that pipeline, in terms of the contracts, in terms of the assurances that you get from your vendors or that you're prepared to give to your customers. So all of those different sort of pillars will be underpinning this sort of governance risk management framework. And obviously building that takes some time, but there are some things that you can get started with pretty quickly, in terms of the high level governance side, the high level policy, starting the mapping, and then over time developing the more granular tools and processes.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, this is best practice, whether or not there's a regulatory imperative to do it. And I think we've seen insurers investing in this for their machine learning and data science teams and their data science implementation. So even though it's probably not AI or not always AI from the definition of the Act, we're seeing insurers very interested just from a risk management perspective, and because of those existing regulations, the consumer regulations, et cetera, which just as applicable to machine learning and statistical models as they are to AI. So that framework, and I think it's a very similar framework actually for machine learning and for AI, is valuable. And what would you say to an insurer that wants to balance this? And maybe we say, well, it sounds like a huge amount of work to build these frameworks. And how do we balance that with actually doing some AI and getting some value out of this?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say two things to that. I mean, one is, the importance of this principle of doing it in a risk-based way and in a proportionate way. So, particularly over time, as AI does become ubiquitous, if it hasn't already, you're not going to be able to get your arms around all of it, or certainly not to the same extent. So you have to sort of keep to this principle of focusing on where are the higher risk systems to the business. But also, hopefully if this sort of framework is done right and it's not done in an overbearing way and it's done in a proportionate way, then it's something that can give confidence to the business, because there is a lot of scaremongering about AI at the moment. A lot of what I see with clients is the fear factor in terms of, not being confident to deploy these solutions or to sort of green light the development of these solutions because they're aware that there's a lot of risk, but they don't sort of know how to address it. And so, if you build the framework correctly, then it gives people the toolkit to do that and the confidence to know that, we can do this. We just have to, sort of comply with these controls, most of which are hopefully common sense, and a number of which, as I touched on earlier, would be things you would want to do anyway in order to ensure the quality of the product and ensure that it's useful to you as a business. So I think that's the key to unlocking this, is doing it in a proportionate way and building something that actually gives confidence to the business to sort of go out and take on the AI challenge and make the most of it.
Yeah, and I think that absolutely goes hand in hand with understanding the use cases, understanding where the value is. And we're seeing more and more sort of actual live use cases coming through in the insurance industry now. And so we're starting to get a picture of where the value lies and where it doesn't lie as well, and some of the false starts that people have had. So if insurers can go and say, well, look, we understand the benefits and we can see the use cases coming out, we can see what the market's doing, and also we can understand the risks, and we've got a framework, then they can be confident from both aspects that what they're doing is the right thing.
Agreed.
Well, thank you so much, James, for joining me today. I think it's been a really interesting conversation from my perspective. I'm excited about AI. I'm now excited that we can also manage the risks of AI. So that's great. So thank you very much for joining me.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Right, and thank you to listeners as well for joining us in this episode. If you found this interesting, then please make sure you join us for future episodes of Rethinking Insurance.
Thank you for joining us for this WTW podcast featuring the latest perspectives on the intersection of people, capital, and risk. For more information, visit the Insights section of WTWCO.com. This podcast is for general discussion and/or information only, is not intended to be relied upon, and action based on or in connection with anything contained herein should not be taken without first obtaining specific advice from a suitably qualified professional.